welcome, let's say everybody, but yeah, welcome everybody who's here. It's good to see you. I think you're going to have an enjoyable evening with Dr. Hoffer, and we appreciate having him here. I'll give you a little bit more introduction in a minute. I do believe, though, that not Vanna, but Hannah has an announcement. Is that right?
Yeah, we have a sign-in sheet. If you could just sign your name and your email so we know who came, especially if you need it for our class, or if you want more information and contact. So I'll just pass that around. Thank you.
No, it's a very interesting time in our history. Maybe you say it about every point in history, right? Because history is interesting. Think?
Yes.
Yeah. But even more so because I think we've probably become complacent in some of the challenges that the world faces, especially when it comes to the political economy and how to solve problems. So for a few weeks, we had a reading group that was reading a book entitled Road to Serfdom. And we have a few of that group here tonight. But when I found out about Dr. Hoffer through the Institute for Humane Studies, who sponsors and provides grants for universities like Spring Arbor to bring experts in their respective fields to campus to talk about things, they suggested to me that Dr. Hoffer was the expert that would fit so nicely with our campus, having graduated from a small liberal arts university or college. They call it college or university? College outside of Pittsburgh, and then he did his doctoral work at the University of West Virginia, and is now an economics professor at the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. And as I think some of you may have heard, he has interest in several topics, not only just Austrian economics, but things like sports economics and experimental economics, behavioral economics, you may know it as. And so, Dr. Hoffer, we do welcome you here tonight, sir. Thank you for taking time away from Wisconsin to come down to see us in Michigan.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak, and certainly all the hospitality that you've shown me since I've been here. I tell you, I'm sadly leaving tomorrow, but I would be glad to come back. I've had a fantastic time on campus, meeting your terrific students, and it has really been a great time. And it's my pleasure to stand here and to talk about socialism today. The goal of my talk this evening is really to do a couple things. First, I want to sell you on the idea that socialism is not dead in the United States and it's not dead globally. If you would have asked me about 10 years ago, and perhaps this is my rather naive assumption being an economist and having witnessed events in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it seemed like the competition of economic ideas on a global scale was sort of over. We knew that whenever we looked at the Cold War, the outcomes between the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union, Russia, that it appeared as if the capitalistic model of the United States and democracy was the clear winner in producing better outcomes on a global scale, and I think a lot of us just assumed that that's the direction we were heading. And the first thing I want to do tonight is to talk about why that's not the case. It doesn't seem to be the case. So I'll start with a little bit of a motivation with a couple quotes here, and then I'll move on and talk about some of the key lessons that we've learned about socialism. Now, as the title might suggest, I don't think socialism is a very good idea. One of the key takeaways and a finding that we see over and over and over again when it comes to observing outcomes with socialism is that we often see that socialism puts us down a path to slavery and outcomes that we really do not want on a scale in any nation in the world. And then finally, what I'll do is I'll end my talk tonight with a case study of where we're seeing socialism be more strongly applied today in the world than ever. I'll do a case study. I'll talk about some of the recent events that have happened in Venezuela, and we can really match up the key lessons that we've learned from socialism over the past century and apply them to exactly what we're seeing happen in the world today. So what I'll open with here, I'm going to do 2 slides of quotes here. The first one here is by Hayek from The Road to Serfdom, and I'll give you a moment to read this on your own. Rereading this quote, I find myself feeling as if I'm standing in Hayek's shoes. Hayek in 1945 thought that the argument, that the debate between capitalism and socialism was over, and that socialism was the less successful of the 2 forms of economic organization. Hayek found himself to be very wrong, in that capitalism was starting anew in the 20th century. And so toward the end of the 20th century, another quote that I like is by Mark Perry. He's a George Mason University graduate. And again, Hayek talks about the fact that we've learned from the 19th century scholars that socialism is not the way to go. And Mark Perry summarizes this in what I love. He calls it the big lie of the 20th century. Right? That socialism would promise better outcomes, but one of the things I'll talk about in just a minute, we can observe those outcomes. Right? It's not just a battle of ideas anymore. We can observe what happened. And Perry summarizes this very well, that it promised prosperity, equality, and security, and it delivered poverty, misery, and tyranny. Yet, the argument for socialism is not dead. This is an article in the Washington Post from March 6th. It's time to give socialism a try. This was yesterday's headline of the day. Bernie Sanders to announce plan to guarantee every American a job. Bernie Sanders is a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. Bernie Sanders would love if the United States were a socialist country and he could be president. And this is an idea that is not dead whatsoever. You could easily argue that Bernie Sanders could have been the Democratic nominee for president if the Democrats hadn't self-interfered in their own primary. And there's a chance that he might have beaten Donald Trump in the race for president of the United States. We are not far from having a self-proclaimed socialist as president of the United States. And so, socialism is alive, and because socialism is alive, that's why I'm here. I'm here to talk about it, to talk about some of what we've learned. So I have 3 lessons that I'm going to come back to. This is sort of the outline of the remainder of the presentation. I'm going to talk about these in detail. The 3 lessons that we can learn from what we've observed in socialism. The first, ideas are important. Evidence is essential. The second, beware the concentration of power. And third, knowledge and incentives determine outcomes. So ideas are important. Evidence is essential. I want to start by saying thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk on this topic. The concept of free speech and the debate of ideas, to me, is at the foundation of what makes this country truly great. So if you were to follow up my presentation by a presentation from a socialist tomorrow, I would not be offended, but indeed, I would be encouraged that the debate is being held in a public forum. All right, so ideas are important, and it's very important that we talk about these things. And why is it so important to talk about these things? For me, I think that the idea, particularly the ideas behind socialism, are really attractive until you look at the evidence. It's the concept of a social utopia. Right? Everybody contributes. You have some minimum standard of living, right? No more poverty. We have more equal outcomes amongst society's members. The famous line used by Karl Marx, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's a beautiful idea. Everybody works as hard as they can, and we support each other by giving everyone what they need. So the ideas are attractive, I get it. But here's where we need the evidence. And it turns out we can observe the evidence of socialism. Countries tried this. It's called the big lie of the 20th century because several countries did try socialism. And there were a lot of common outcomes. If we look at socialism throughout the 20th century, we see repeated outcomes in every country that tried this. Amongst those common outcomes, 3 stand out in particular: labor camps, starvation, and walls. This is a picture of the Berlin Wall. When we think of socialism, the countries that immediately come to mind, at least for me, are the USSR or Russia, China, Cuba, and North Korea. These are not countries in which I currently want to live, nor are they countries in which I would have wanted to live for much of the 20th century. Socialism's purpose of putting up a wall is not to keep people out, but to keep people in. It sounds an awful more lot like a prison. And there are strong punishments for leaving. If you are caught trying to flee North Korea today, the guards along the border are told to shoot on sight. This was the case in Berlin in the 1940s. In Cuba, armed guards escort the national baseball team as they play off of Cuban soil. They don't do that to protect the players. They do that to try to keep the players from fleeing to other countries like the United States. I teach sports economics, and if you have a chance, just read the story of Yasiel Puig's escape from Cuba to the United States. We can talk about walls, and I'll come back to the idea of labor camps and slavery later on. But I want to mention what is perhaps the most egregious of all the atrocities created by socialism, and that is starvation. In socialist countries, people starve to death. And I'm not talking about a few people as if that would be any better. Mao Zedong's proclaimed Great Leap Forward, the movement that was to move China into a new era and make China incredibly better for the Chinese, for the world. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward resulted in 45 million Chinese deaths from starvation in 4 years. More people have died from starvation under socialism in the 20th century than all of the wars in the 20th century combined. This is what socialism brings, starvation. It is remarkable to be able to analyze a before and after of socialism. We can see the effects within a city in Berlin. You can track the effects of what happens if you happen to be caught on the wrong side of a wall when it was built. we can look at socialism around the world today, and what I really love is that we have free and accessible data that can measure the degree to which we have this concept called economic freedom. There's an organization in Canada, the Fraser Institute, that puts together the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And what they do is they use only publicly available data from secondhand sources. It's none of the data that they collect themselves. And they put together 5 metrics on how economically free society is. The more free, this tends to be more on the capitalistic spectrum, the less free, closer towards socialism. They measure those outcomes, and then they aggregate it together to come up with an index. Something that, on the next slide, I'll show you a map of the world. I'll show you what this looks like. It's also data you can use should you ever want to look at it. They measure countries on 5 different dimensions: the size of the government as a percentage of all expenditures in a country, how well does a country enforce property rights or have a fair and independent judicial system, how sound is the currency or the money in the country. This will be particularly important when I talk about Venezuela later. Is the country free to trade internationally or not? And how much regulation, what is the burden of regulation on the economy? So what we see here is a map of the world broken down into quartiles. So blue, the countries that are blue are the most free. The countries that are green are the second most free, followed by yellow and finally red. Now, what's rather remarkable is that you could take this map and overlay it with a map of, say, income growth, development, economic activity, and they look very, very similar. On the next couple slides, I'll show you some of the basic data analysis that we can use to examine what kind of effects do these broad, general system of government policies have on a country. So let's look at just general income. What is it like on an average individual person's income for a year? In the most free country, wages average $38,600 a year. In the least free country, just about $7,000 a year. And these are adjusted for purchasing power parity. Right? So that is $7,000 of goods that could be bought in the United States. And now, one of the arguments that I hear all the time is that capitalism only benefits the rich. Right? This is one of the strongest tools that socialists use. Socialists want to help the poor. Right? So let's look at the data for the poorest 10%. What does poverty look like around the world by capitalist versus socialistic government structure? Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that poverty in the United States is not a problem. It is a problem, and it is a problem that we should work on trying to address together in a variety of forms. The poorest 10% of people in the most free countries earn about $10,000 a year in income. I don't want to live on $10,000 a year. I did it in graduate school. I'm happy to not have to do it anymore. So we can recognize that poverty is a problem in this country, yet at the same time make the comparison that it is not at all in any way similar to poverty in some of these other countries. Poverty in the United States is a struggle. Poverty in the least free countries in the world is survival. That's $1,600 a year in total income. In over half of these countries, average incomes are less than $1,000 a year. And again, that's $1,000 of what you could buy here in the United States. It's survival. That's all that it is. the ability to buy food and maybe be able to sleep indoors for part of the year. What does it look like in terms of life expectancy? Average life expectancy in the most free countries is over 80 years old. We live to 80. In the least free countries, 63. I've heard it explained, and the example that has stuck with me, that is the example between being able to see your grandchildren while you're alive. Making it to 80 versus making it to 63. And perhaps the statistic that, for me, hits home the hardest. I recently became a father. I have a 2-year-old at home who is the joy of my life. If we look at infant mortality by free versus least free countries, infant mortality per 1,000 births, that's the y-axis there, in the most free countries is 7. So that's 7 out of every 1,000. That's less than 1% of infants fail to make it to 6 months of age. In the least free countries, almost 50. 5% of children that are born don't make it to 6 months of age. This is a stunning difference that is entirely unnecessary. It's a system, it's an economic system that has been imposed on people that literally makes them poorer, their lives shorter, and less likely to have their children live. There's an organization from where I got this chart, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. They do an awful lot of work in the intersection of Christian beliefs and capitalism, and their work is really terrific. I was reading some of it just last night. If you're interested, you can look them up and you can find where I got this graph from, and lots of other good work on economic systems, describing the difference between what we call economic freedom, this ability for individuals to make their own choices, versus a socialistic system in which choices are made for people by some organizing body. All right, so the evidence is as clear to me as any evidence that I've seen doing data work on anything. Socialism produces worse outcomes than capitalism. So, why does that happen? And can we see the warning signs coming? So our second lesson, beware the concentration of power. As the famous saying goes, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Hayek dedicates an entire chapter of The Road to Serfdom to explaining why it is that the leaders of these socialist countries, and really of any society on the planet, end up not giving us the outcomes that we want. Hayek calls it why the worst get on top. And the basic answer is that only a certain set of people are willing to do what it takes to rise to that degree of power. And the people who are willing to do that tend to be the people that we do not want making the decisions for us. And when we think about power, what I want you to think about is on the next 2 slides. I have images of individuals from the United States. And I want you to ask yourselves, how much of my personal well-being, how many of my choices do I want the following people to make for me? The past 2 presidents of the United States are about as far from each other in terms of political ideology as you can get within the United States. very few people that I know would be happy, are happy, with the outcomes created by both of these presidents. Now, I put this up here to illustrate, within the United States, we don't see consistent outcomes amongst our elected officials. And if that's the case, then perhaps we shouldn't have others making decisions for us. Now, if we come back to the idea, why is this the case? Right, so, what's wrong with somebody else having power, somebody else having the ability to make decisions for us? There are two big things that come up again and again. The first is that preferences do not aggregate, and rights are non-negotiable. Where we see socialism, even if socialism is the outcome of the majority of the population, that does not mean that that the outcomes that that majority chooses are just and right for everyone. As recent as the 1960s in the United States, there were southern states that held ballot votes to decide whether to integrate schools. Those ballots were overwhelmingly voted down by a majority of white voters. In economics, we call this tyranny of the majority. So if we look at socialists or fascist rulers throughout history, if they are voted or given power by a majority of the population, that gives them the ability to take away rights that should be non-negotiable from others. I'll borrow a quote from a presentation I saw last year. It takes a government to do an Auschwitz. Could an individual do this on the scale that the Nazis were able to do this? Absolutely not. It takes power, organization, and of course a degree of cruelty and malice that is almost unparalleled. It takes a government to do this, but not just any government. Not just any government could do this. This had to be a government which gave an extraordinary amount of power to a single individual. A single individual who in this case did not like a particular group of the population. It seems insane that this could happen in today's world. This image seems like eons ago. But these kind of egregious human rights violations continue today. And where do they continue? They continue in fascist and socialist dictatorships. We don't see these in democracies. The United States is far from perfect on our social justice record. There is no doubt of that. But to the extent that we can decentralize power, we can help prevent these kind of egregious outcomes. I think perhaps the United States' most successful and prevailing system is the system of checks and balances we have, particularly in the court system. The number of things that have been voted down, particularly for human rights violations in the United States, that the courts have put an end to, in my opinion, it is the courts that have saved the United States from becoming potentially one of these other societies that creates these kind of egregious crimes. So to the extent that is at all possible, we should try to decentralize power. And then finally, the economist in me cannot resist talking about why it is that socialism fails on an economic scale. And the answer is that socialism ignores the very fundamental tenets that we know make economies and economics work. That is, we know knowledge and incentives determine outcomes. Among F.A. Hayek's most famous works within economics is a paper he wrote called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And what Hayek argues is that at the fundamental level, what economics is really about is how best to use the information that is available to us. And we can see this all the time. I consider myself pretty well informed about economics. I think those of you seated in the seats have a better idea of the economy of Spring Arbor than do I. Why is that the case? You have what Hayek refers to as local knowledge. He says that knowledge and information is captured in the individual. Only the individual knows how to best satisfy his or her wants and needs. And attempting to do what Hayek calls any sort of top-down planning or systems are going to fail. They're going to underperform compared to allowing individuals to just choose for themselves. And then the second part of that, we know that incentives matter. And this might be psychology 101, but we know that incentives matter. Rewards and punishments can shape behavior. This is perhaps the most studied topic in all of economics, and I'd love to read studies that do study this. Economists have seen that incentives matter in influencing people's decision to work and save, people's decision to obtain an education. Thank you for being here. The decision to how to allocate your time. Again, thanks for being here. We see that incentives matter for when people have children, if they have children. There are literally millions of examples out there, the price mechanism being the key tie between knowledge and incentives within a market system. That is, prices tell us, prices can signal information very quickly and extremely concisely. And then we can act on that information by making our own decisions on whether or not to purchase a good or service, whether or not to work, if so, how much and how hard to work. Markets incentivize the use of knowledge in cooperation. In a market economy, you need only ask yourself, if you want to become wealthy, how well can I serve my fellow man? How do you become wealthy in a market system? By making people better off, as many people as much as possible. That's it. I have an iPhone on me. I love this device. Right? I paid for it with my own money. I'm extremely thankful that Steve Jobs and the Apple development team made this device that I can use. I was happy to purchase it. By me purchasing this and by millions and millions of other Americans doing the same thing, the owners and founders of Apple became fabulously rich. If you own stock in the company, you became wealthy. In a market economy, the question of how to become wealthy is very straightforward. How can I improve the lives of my fellow man? Socialism offers different incentives. On one hand, socialism still keeps the charitable incentive in place. That is, if you do well in a socialistic society, say you create a new product, you can still improve the lives of all of your fellow citizens. But what goes away is the significant reward to yourself. That is, you cannot become wealthy, you cannot become fabulously wealthy in these systems by definition. And what we observe from repeated behavior take away some of the incentive, you take away some of the behavior. And over time, what this leads to is far less investments, far less innovation, and much more of a desire to substitute time not working for time working. So I'd like to take all of the points that I've talked about and talk about what's going on in Venezuela right now. That is, whenever I first learned about socialism, socialism was tied to the USSR, the Soviet Union, a country that collapsed around the time that I was born. My guess is very few people in this room were alive when the Soviet Union was still in existence, although I believe most of us are still familiar with Russia. But I want to talk about Venezuela because Venezuela, for a short period of time, represented every socialist dream. I'll give you a short history of what happened in the country, and then I want to give you a snapshot of where the country is today. Now, I pulled this image of the flag last night, and I could not resist myself of putting on the slides, what do you get when you just Google the word Venezuela and click on images? We get the flag, and what do we see? Protests, fire in some form, protests, people waiting in line for food, a hope and a dream of, looks like they're moving to Alaska there, but, and then a maps of where the country are. Venezuela is in awful shape at the moment. And what this country really represents is a dramatic rise and the completely foreseeable tragic fall. So what happened in Venezuela? In the mid-90s, Venezuela was about middle of the world on any measurement that you wanted to pull. Economic freedom, life expectancy, income per capita. Venezuela was right around the middle of the world on all of these measurements. In 1998, Hugo Chavez came to power, and what he promised was what he called a third way, a way that was different. And it was far different from capitalism, yet different from the failed socialist attempts that had been tried before and eventually failed. His idea was rather straightforward. The government under his control would seize all of the oil companies in the country. It is now estimated that Venezuela may sit on the largest oil reserve in the entire world. So Chavez was going to seize all of these oil companies, and he did, and then take the income from those oil companies and fund social programs. It was an idea that within the country drew a lot of public support. But the problem is that this suffers from the same problems that every socialistic society has suffered from. The socialists assumed that when they seized the oil companies, everything else would go on as normal. The oil companies would in some way not be upset that all of their assets had just been taken from them. That no other businesses would worry that they might be next. And so what happened after the socialists confiscated the infrastructure and equipment was that after they did this, there was no more effort put into repairing, maintaining, or developing new infrastructure. At first, none of that mattered. As you can imagine, if you take something at once, you could steal a car, and at first it will still run. But it only works for a short period of time. From 2004 through 2008, Venezuela's economy skyrocketed along with the price of oil. The company was booming, and this became, for that period of time, the socialist dream. Here we have a government seizing all of these private property assets, and the economy does extraordinarily well. Annual growth rate, so adjusted for inflation and per person, they grew at an astounding 11% per year. For comparison, the United States has been growing at about 2 or 3% on average for about the past 20 years. Poverty fell, inequality fell, and socialists everywhere pointed to Chavez's Venezuela as the model of socialism done right. But then something happened. Eventually, the failure, the lack of investment in maintaining the public infrastructure and public equipment, combined with a decrease in the price of oil, dramatically decreased the government's revenues. Economic growth slowed. It slowed quickly until it eventually stopped. Because remember, there was no new investment coming in. There was very little incentive to invest for the future because people were worried that if they actually did well, what they developed would be taken from them. As the government's tax revenues declined, their debt started to grow. To combat the increasing debt, the government decided to print more money. As they printed more money, this led to inflation. With inflation, the price of goods that consumers were used to buying became more expensive and people grew unhappy. The government's response to the higher prices was to implement price ceilings. A price ceiling does nothing to increase the supply of a good, and so price ceilings, as you would expect, led immediately to vast and rapid shortages. There was no profit to innovate, no profit to create new supplies of these goods. And so the country started a downward spiral in which it now finds itself. Of countries measured, Venezuela is now the least free country in the world. We'll take that with a grain of salt in that we don't have enough data to measure North Korea because we can't get in there. North Korea would probably be worse. Okay, so if we come back, the socialist paradigm that is Venezuela is in an awful lot of trouble. If we come back to what do we use to measure economic freedom, the size of government. The size of government is an overwhelming majority of the economic production in the country. Legal system and property rights fail miserably because the government can just take things whenever they want it. Sound money, Venezuela is the worst in the world by a large margin. I'll talk about their currency in just a moment. Freedom to trade internationally, the country is able to trade internationally, but nobody wants their currency, which makes it awfully hard to buy things internationally. Venezuela has become and will become, for future textbooks, the textbook example of hyperinflation. I had to get these numbers again last night because my numbers from a week ago were obsolete. Current estimates are that Venezuela is seeing about a 13,000% increase in inflation. If you look at the historic average of, this is the exchange rate between US dollars and the Venezuelan bolivar, traditionally, one US dollar was worth about 6 or 7 Venezuelan bolivars. And this was the case up until 2018. Imagine going from $6 or $7 to 1 to, as of last night, 66,860 to 1. In February, the country attempted to decrease its inflation by devaluing its own currency by 99.6%. You can only devalue something 100%. So I want you to imagine how If you have been living your life in Venezuela and saving your entire life for retirement, your entire life savings has gone from, if you have $1 million, it would be worth approximately $4. So what's happened in Venezuela? With a massive government collapse, the currency has essentially turned worthless. We see the development of people turning toward Bitcoin mining as a way to live, because you might be able to produce $500 a month in the virtual digital currency. One of this might be my favorite slide that I put up here. Venezuela's nemesis is a hardware salesman at Home Depot in Alabama. This guy is a Venezuelan immigrant to the United States, and what he set up was a website that a black market exchange that you could trade Venezuelan bolivars for any currency that you wanted. The currency is so worthless in Venezuela that they prevent people from trading it. You're not allowed to sell it to buy dollars or anything else. So this man created a black market and was named enemy #1 of the state in Venezuela. I'm not joking, he just works at a Home Depot in Alabama. He has 2 partners, one a tech guy from New York City and the other one a real estate broker from Miami that helped him create the website. And they made, I think, maybe about $4,000 a month in the total exchanges. About $15 million changes hands daily on their website. The black market of Venezuela. In one of his quotes, and I love this, he said, it's ironic that with Dollar Today, the website that he runs, that is the black market exchange, it is ironic that with Dollar Today in Alabama, I do more damage to the government than I did as a military militia man in Venezuela. And so as you can imagine, I mentioned that the predictable outcomes of shortages come with price ceilings and hyperinflation. And so a majority of the economy in Venezuela has begun to turn underground. Black markets emerge, and when black markets are the only markets, I don't know if you can call them black markets anymore. The capital of Venezuela is now the murder capital of the world. And pirates rule the economy in a literal sense. A majority of the pirating occurs as much across borders as possible, but also people in speedboats bring in goods from Trinidad and Tobago, which is not far off the shore of Venezuela. And so if you want to see what the face of pirating looks like in Venezuela, it's this guy. If you ask yourself what goods are in highest demand, what are people really willing to pay money for in Venezuela? The answer is bread and diapers. And sometimes condoms. So on a black market site, you can buy any kind of goods. So the website is Mercado Libre. And what we've seen is that one of the challenges that you might expect with a government determining what is produced, how much is produced, and how much to charge, you get massive shortages of things. And with massive shortages come short-term extreme price hikes when lots of places run out of things. I checked on the website 2 days ago, and the pack of condoms is back down to only about, exchange rate, $40. But this is what happens in times of extreme shortages. When you go to the store and they're completely out of something, people turn to the black market, and prices can get really expensive really quickly. In Venezuela, there are daily protests for food. Between January and April of this year, the Venezuelan Observatory of Social Conflict registered 2,138 protests, most of them for food. The stories of starvation in China and in the USSR have seemingly gone unobserved by the socialists that want socialism in Venezuela. Food lines are a daily occurrence, and people are unhappy. A reporter who talked to people in line, and I want you to think about for a moment the people that are living this. The reporter interviewed a mother of 4. And she said the rumor was that they might have chicken that day. I haven't been able to buy chicken in more than a month, so I left my home to go get in line at 4 o'clock in the morning. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guards decided that the food truck wouldn't stop. And they got no food. The country is literally running out of food. So in 2016, the current president, President Nicolas Maduro, offered a presidential decree in an executive order that bypassed the people and anyone of Congress, that declared that the president could, by his decree, force any public or private sector employee, anyone, could be forced to farm fields for up to 60 days at a time or longer, quote, if circumstances needed, or if circumstances merit. That is, at any point in time, the president can take any member of society and force them to go work in the fields for a 60-day term. And there's nothing stopping that 60-day term from being immediately repeated for as long as the president so wishes. This is the concentration of power and the ability to essentially enslave any member of the society that the president wishes. The end result of socialism is slavery and death on a massive scale. Now, I realize that this is rather depressing, right? But the point of this talk is not to be depressing, but rather to educate. We know that ideas are important, which is why I find it absolutely necessary to talk about these kinds of things. The evidence is essential and is around us as I speak. Right? We should be aware of the concentration of power, and we know that knowledge and incentives determine outcomes. This is our basic economics. But I want to end on a positive note, if I can. The positive note is that we know how to fix the problem. We know how to fix these problems. We know how to avoid these problems. We know how to improve lives in our country and around the world. And the answer is very simple, it's freedom. From an economic stance, economic freedom. And if you are disheartened and saddened at the lives of the citizens of Venezuela, as you should be, and I know that I am, I will let you know that the turnarounds can be very fast and very quick. Do not underestimate human ingenuity. If we give people opportunities, they will thrive. If the price controls were lifted, and a less socialist regime were put into place in the country, the turnaround in the country would be very rapid. Again, do not underestimate human ingenuity. And I think that the future for our country and for other countries around the world is very bright. But it is essential that we talk about these ideas and these outcomes so that we can make that future the future that we want it to be. Thank you. Any questions? I think we have time for a few.
Yeah, we might have some mics up here. I was gonna see if we had, are there any mics up there? I thought I saw some.
They were here.
Yeah, they were. Over here now?
No.
About one. I'm sure I got all of them. Is the red light the right color?
No, that's
Oh, it's green
great.
now. Green.
I have heard that most economists are socialists. Is that accurate or not? Do you know?
I would say that's not accurate. I would say that most economists are very liberal in their social views, but on the conservative spectrum, if you want to call it conservative, on their economic views. That
Okay.
is,
Well,
most
then-
economists sort of realize the things that I've talked about.
Yeah, since it is so obvious, how could any economist not be in favor of a free government? Is it what, moral turpitude or stupidity, or how could anybody not see the results of this and not understand it clearly?
It's hard for me to speak for others. That is, I look at it and I ask that same question of colleagues of mine. I ask that question of MIT economists that are very well known. And I cannot answer why it is that it seems like they consistently miss the big picture and the stories of history. Because the themes that I see come up again and again is that this time will be different. The last time failed because of, pick your reason. And it's almost always, well, the last time failed because the guy that was running things was evil or malicious or stupid, right? Just pick your reason. But this time, especially if I'm in charge, it would work really well. Right, and so some of it is hubris, some of it is ignorance, I think. I wish fewer economists were on board with these ideas. I think it would make my life a little better, and it would make it more difficult to get these kind of policies in play. Part of the problem is that I think there's a small minority of economists that think this way. But if a politician goes looking, they can find them. They can find somebody that will give them the answers they want.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
On the map of freedom that you showed, Scandinavia was on the most free category, essentially.
Yeah.
They had a lot of socialist practices, I think, universal healthcare and a high tax. So, why is that the case, and what do you have to say about that?
Sure, it's interesting. In the most recent Economic Freedom of the World Index rankings, the United States fell below Canada.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, this was really big news in Canada. The Canadian economists in particular were feeling very smug presenting their results at the conference. And the answer is quite simple, is that, right, you don't need to score perfect on every category to get into the most free range, right? So, again, you can think of Canada being more economically free as the United States, and it seems almost ludicrous. Like, how is this possible? And then I want you to think about the things that have happened in the past 10 years. Quantitative easing of the money supply. That's a fancy word for saying printing more money. bailouts of banks. That's not very supportive of what we would consider market activity. The use of eminent domain has increased significantly. That is, the government is legally able to take someone's property without their consent. So the United States is on, to some degrees, a scary trajectory. That is, the size of our government has increased dramatically under both parties, right? So it's not a Democrat-Republican thing. We've seen record spending under Bush, record spending under Obama, and then record spending under Trump. It's one regime after another that has really changed the way that the United States is in terms of their market structure and how they compare to other countries in the world. And so yes, the Scandinavian countries, they're certainly not perfect, right? I mean, I don't know if there's anywhere in the world that I say it's perfect, right? But in terms of some of the basics of economics, like, yes, if you were to get a job there and right after you graduate, right, you go there and you know when you get on that plane that they're going to have a high tax rate and these large social programs, right? But you also know that if you buy a house, you're going to be able to stay in the house, right? If you know that if you hold currency, it's unlikely to you're unlikely to see 100 or 1,000% inflation in a year, right? And so there are still sound economic principles in play, even though we think of these countries as, you know, the pseudo-socialist ideas that are propped up when you think of Finland or Sweden or, you know, some of these other European countries. They're more free than we give them credit for in a lot of different categories. That was a great question.
Just talk right.
So, like, in terms of the United States, what do you attribute the the fact that people are so into like socialism now? What do you attribute that to?
It's a great question. I don't know if I have a single answer. I would say that the most likely outcome is that people are unhappy. People are unhappy on a lot of different outcomes, right? We're unhappy with how the government is spending their money. We're unhappy with the amount of debt we have. We're unhappy with the way that businesses are able to influence politics and market outcomes. We're unhappy with social outcomes and inequality that we observe. And these are all measurable and these are all problems. And so people see the problems and they start looking for answers. And some of the answers sound really attractive. Remember, if you think about Bernie Sanders' promises in his campaign speech, right? I mean, of the things he promised, you can understand why they might be attractive to a lot of people. He offered free college education for everyone. Right? That's a hard one to pry away from students. That's a hard one to get students to say, like, yeah, that sounds bad. Maybe. One of the other candidates pick up just that idea. Right? And so some of these ideas, again, that it's easy to promise outcomes like more equal outcomes. But it's tougher to say how we're going to actually get those outcomes, and nobody promises the eventual outcomes of we're going to decrease investment in our infrastructure, and we're going to see decreased investment in the country, and people are going to feel less safe. Nobody talks about those sorts of things. It's all the potential benefits, right? And so that's one of the reasons I think it's so essential to keep reminding people of what we've actually seen happen when we've seen countries try this before, right? This time will not be different. It won't. And hopefully we can convince enough people of that in advance that we don't try it again.
One more question. So I'll ask one. I think there are about 10 of them I wanted to ask. Which, as an aside, maybe you read about some of the Bitcoin participation, trying to generate Bitcoin in Venezuela. I do believe that they put limits on how much electric energy people can use for that. Did I read that? Because
Sure.
as you probably know, to generate Bitcoin, right, you've got to use a lot of electric energy to run your
It
computer.
probably doesn't work well anymore, trying to find bitcoins there.
So, what about the difference, even in the United States, between state, I should say sovereign state to sovereign state, in terms of their economic policies, and as they tend more towards a socialistic, what happens to, for instance, like high-income earners?
Mhm. So I think it was Tocqueville that called the United States, you know, the grand experiment in democracy, right? And we have 50 united yet independent states, right? And the beautiful thing that I enjoy about looking at the different states and how states operate is that this can be the experimental lab of democracy, right? And we can try different things at the state level, right? So the state of New York is probably going to increase its income tax rate again. Right? And we have states with remarkably, I mean, stunningly high tax rates. And a lot of them are concentrated in the Northeast, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Right? But that doesn't stop other states from going the other direction. There was a period in time, there's a graphic I have in a different presentation. Governor Rick Perry of Texas hand wrote letters to thousands of businesses in California and said, move to Texas. Our tax rate is better. Our business climate is better. All you have to do is move here. Right? And it has started to happen. Austin, Texas, I would say, is probably the most likely next Silicon Valley, if you want to call it that. Why? Because Texas can promote freedom and offer attractive tax rates, and it can pull people who want to move. That is, maybe the greatest thing is that in the United States, you can do the proverbial vote with your feet. If you don't like what's going on where you are, you can move. You can't do that everywhere in the world. And you can't necessarily do that from outside the United States to the United States, which would be another hour presentation that we talk about here, to get into the international migration issue, which I think is of almost equal importance of what we talked about tonight, if not as important in a close second. One of the challenges that we see in the United States is that even if you dislike what's going on in your state and you move to another state, the largest source of taxation in the United States is the federal government. Right? So states can only compete so much with one another. Cities can only compete so much with one another under the umbrella of a federal system that sets income tax rates, for example. Right? So on the margin, there's room for improving your life by voting with your feet, but if you dislike what's going on at the federal level, there's not much you can do. So it comes back to one of the points I talked about before: decentralize these decisions. Right? Let's stop making these decisions in Washington, D.C., and I would much rather see most of the spending decisions made at the state capital level. Right? And if we can go another step down, make them at City Hall instead of in D.C. I would much rather see that. But I know the mayor of my town because he teaches a night class on Tuesdays. I like him more than I like Donald Trump, having never met Donald Trump. Right, and it's not as if I would trust my mayor per se to run the La Crosse, Wisconsin healthcare system, right? But again, that just gives more evidence for let's decentralize it even further, right? And so, to the extent that's possible, I'd like to see the ability for states and cities to compete with each other more, right? And the only way that can happen is to take the power away from Washington and, at the very least, give it to states. So that's a step in the right direction.
Dr. Hoffer, I want to thank you so much for your presentation this evening. I don't know, we're going to be able to get a copy of that. We might like
Sure.
to make it available to.
Sam should have all the slides.
You have all those slides? Wonderful.
She did the printing for me.
So let's give a hand to Dr. Hawker. Thank you very much.